Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. From North Korea to Syria, President Donald Trump's foreign policy is literally all over the map. North Korea says it is open to direct talks with Washington, only to be met with preconditions. In Syria, where the U.S. has no legal right to be in the first place, peace is within view. But this is not what the Trump administration wants. Cross-talking missing diplomacy, I'm joined by my guest, Earl Rasmussen in Washington. He is the Executive Vice President of the Eurasia Center. In New York, we have Daniel Lazar. He is an author and freelance journalist who writes frequently about the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the U.S. Constitution. And in Fort Lauderdale, we have Ivan Elan. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Daniel, let me go to you first here. We're calling this program Missing Diplomacy. And let's look at two areas where a lot of diplomacy is necessary: North Korea and Syria. In both cases, there have been or still present some kind of diplomatic opening. Considering the very fierce rhetoric we've heard about a second phase, and when we look at from the Trump administration for North Korea, and then the U.S. Essentially obstructing a number of peace processes and designs in Syria. Where is the diplomacy? Daniel, go ahead.
Diplomacy is absent. We have a very erratic individual at the top, Donald Trump, who has little idea what he's doing. But it's very important to emphasize that the U.S. empire is vastly overextended. It's gotten itself in deep trouble in a number of parts of the world, including Korea and Syria. And so there really is no easy way out. So Trump's confusion is a reflection of the larger confusion of the U.S. system.
Okay, Ivan, that's a point, you know, and we could put it on the person of Donald Trump, but I would put it on the people he's surrounded himself with. My impression, and I'm very far away, is that he's basically disinterested in these topics and he's delegated it to others, and unfortunately a lot of them are neocons. Go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. His campaign pledges were different than than what he's doing now. His pledges was let's stay out of a lot of stuff. America first. Let's do what we need to do here at home, etc. And get in. Don't do nation building overseas, etc. But I do agree that the U.S. has been overextended for a long period of time, and he's exacerbating the problem. And it is very confusing to him because his advisors do not give him the option of saying, well, you know, we deterred radical Mao Zedong when he got nuclear weapons in China, so he can probably deter Kim Jong-un in North Korea, because dictators, they just want to survive. That's their main goal, is surviving in power. And so, you know, why threaten a paranoid guy, right? But, you know, that's not what they're doing. In Syria, of course, his main objective was to, he said, was to get ISIS. Well, ISIS is at least, you know, vastly shrunk in size of territory. Now, whether they'll come back elsewhere, I don't know. But certainly, if you've done with the job, get out. But of course, the United States is not doing that because it has forces on the ground. It wants to keep control of territory so that it has a role in the Syrian negotiations. That's a much different mission than we started with.
You know, Earl, you know, that's exactly right. And you could apply that, you know, Syria staying there to determine political outcomes, staying in South Korea to determine political outcomes. That is exactly it. And it's a zero-sum game. Either we get what we want or there's going to be trouble. There could be potentially even war. I mean, that's not how you run a foreign policy. Well, if that is foreign policy, it's an extension of military policy. And it precludes or excludes the possibility of peacemaking. You can think whatever you want of the North Korean regime, but if the North Korean regime and South Korea are talking and both want to talk more, and the South wants the U.S. to talk to North Korea, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because the alternative is far, far worse. Go ahead, Earl.
Yeah, I think, Peter, it's unfortunate, but I don't necessarily think people want a direct conflict. However, we're getting dangerously close that one could accidentally happen, especially when we've got erratic leaders in place that want their survival, or they're looking for the political perspective, and they back in their own selves in their corner, and sometimes things happen that you don't expect. But I think when we look at Syria, you know, the U.S. is concerned about the rising role of Iran and Russia in the Middle East, and I think there's pressure from both from the U.S. side, from one of their close allies in the area, as well as some of the Gulf states. They do not want to see Iran raising up. So you see these accusations are violating the nuclear accord. You see them trying to, even though they're welcome in Syria, trying to force them to get out of the region. It's a dangerous situation there, and the U.S. really right now appears they just want to stay present there and present in Korea as well to really, I don't know if it's necessary to counter North Korea more than just as much as perhaps to counter the rising influence of China in the region as well. Of
course, that's the whole point, okay? That's why they want to stay there. They want to determine, well, first of all, they want to make sure that if there's a unification of the peninsula, they determine what that unification is, because going right up to China's border would be what the present White House would very much want. And the Chinese don't want that to happen. No surprise. Daniel, let me go to you. You know, Earl was mentioning about U.S. presence in Syria and Iran. Well, I mean, it's the activities of the United States in the region since 2003 that has only advanced the interests of Iran. I mean, how many more events do we have to go through? How many more failed regimes do we have to go through in that region to show that the more you push for regime change, the more you push to determine political outcomes, the more you lose. I mean, it's a losing streak, okay, for over a decade and a half, but nobody realizes that. Go ahead, Daniel.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, the U.S. policy in that part of the world has been just amazingly wrong-headed. The invasion of Iraq provided a huge opening to Iran, America's alleged, #1 enemy in the region. You said before that, that America wants certain things, in Korea and Syria, but it's not really clear that America even knows what it wants beyond limiting Russian, Iranian, or Chinese influence. But otherwise, it has no idea. It has no positive program. So therefore the U.S. is trying, is acting at the behest of Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia is maybe falling apart very rapidly. Israel may be facing regime change also as Netanyahu struggles to maintain his grip. So things are crumbling really fast. The U.S. has no idea how to stay on top of these things. And of course, as you say, everything it does seems to make things worse.
Yes, I mean, it's pushing these pushing for political outcomes. There's an impatience going on right here. I mean, the United States, and I'll just give my opinion, is scared to death that peace could break out on the Korean Peninsula. They're terrified of that. They're terrified that peace could break out in Syria because the very fact that they stay there where nobody wants them to be there makes it a political outcome, a peaceful outcome, impossible. I mean, why are they so afraid of peace? Go ahead, Ivan.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. They seem to want to maintain overseas presence in South Korea and Japan. That's where our major forces are right now. And that gives us, an anchor in East Asia. And I think they do feel that China is rising. And, just like when Saddam invaded Kuwait, that was a way to stay in Saudi Arabia for a long time. And so I think these types of conflicts are useful in a certain sense for the hegemon to stay in whatever region they want to stay in.
Yeah. Earl, if we look at the South Korean peninsula, let's look at the region. We got Japan, we got South Korea, we got North Korea, we got China, and we got Russia. Those countries can solve this tension on the peninsula all by themselves, but the U.S. will not let that happen. The U.S. will not allow South Korea full sovereignty over its defense planning. And this is the real problem here. I think it could be solved with regional players. Go ahead, Earl.
I would agree. In fact, I made a comment on a blog recently. They were talking about there was some type of conference in Vancouver that Canada was hosting. Of course, the U.S. was there and other players, but two players to discuss the resolution, what direction to go forward on Korea. And of course, the two players that probably should most importantly be there, Russia and China were not invited. Yeah. And so I think it's you know, I agree that I think, and I also think the new president of South Korea is open to dialogue with North Korea. I think you saw that during the Olympics, a potential, you know, maybe a slight melting of some ice there. But I do not think the U.S. sees it as in their interest to actually have a dialogue unless it's under their terms. And unfortunately, I think, personally, I agree. I think the regional powers there could come to a very good settlement. It could be general for everyone. But the U.S. wants to play the role as far as determining what the conditions are. And I don't think that's very healthy for the future of Korea and for the region, and it's very dangerous under the current environment.
Let me go to Daniel before we go to the break here. One of the things I find very problematic, troubling, is that diplomacy is equated with appeasement these days. That is terrifying. Go ahead, Daniel.
Yes, it is. It's, the U.S. is in a very militant mood. It's not interested in diplomacy or talking. Look, America wants to prolong its unipolar moment, which broke out in 1989. But now it's faced with challenges by China, Iran, and Russia, and it's trying to hold them off, trying very hard. I don't see how that strategy will be successful, but that's what the U.S. is trying to do.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Gents, I got to jump in here. We're going to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on missing diplomacy. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing missing diplomacy. Okay, let's go back to New York with Daniel. Daniel, you want to finish up your point, the one that you were elaborating on before the break?
Yeah. Yeah, my point simply is the U.S. is trying to fend off a triple threat from Iran, Russia, and China. And there is complete unanimity. I've seen no dissent whatsoever among any of the mainstream commentators or politicians, liberal, conservative, or what have you. They all agree that they must rebut the Russian, Chinese, and Iranian threat, menace. And I can't see how that strategy can possibly prevail.
Well, you know, Ivan, I don't agree that they're threats whatsoever. I mean, China is a regional power. Russia is certainly not a global power. Its reach is actually quite small. If you look at Russian foreign policy and defense policy, it's they're most concerned about their sovereignty more than anything else, and the near abroad. I know some people don't like that term, but it's real. Okay, I mean these threats here in Iran, it's surrounded by NATO or NATO-related countries' bases. I mean, this is all a fiction here, but it certainly is very good for the arms industry. I mean, and Donald Trump has been such a sugar daddy to them this year and next year for sure. Go ahead, Ivan.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And we can also add that our South Korean, Japanese, and European allies are all very wealthy countries.
Absolutely.
And this is not 1950 anymore. And they can start taking over their own defenses. What about a deal in Korea that says North Korea denuclearizes if the U.S. withdraws all forces from South Korea and South Korea defends itself? You know, we wouldn't have to be immediately over time. That's a possibility, you know, if we want to do something dramatic. But that's, of course, that's not going to happen. That's wishful thinking because there's a military-industrial complex in many countries, but the one here in the United States, we tend to build up threats larger than they are, and I think your assessment of the various threats was pretty accurate. China may rise, but of course all the countries in Asia could band together. And they have fairly good internal security. Japan's an island that's very safe. You just have to run a porcupine strategy, etc. European allies have more combined economy, GDP, than the United States does. So, and of course, in the Middle East, it's sort of a canard that we need to defend oil. The market is much better at providing oil at the cheapest prices.
Exactly. You know, Earl, one of the things is if you look at the client states and the alliances that the United States has created around the globe, these client states do like the status quo for the most part. South Korea in this moment may be a little bit different because they might see it some kind of diplomatic opening and want to take it, and Washington will say no. But like, look at Japan, you know, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Israel. I mean, they're all fat and happy. I mean, the American taxpayer pays for it. They don't even have to be particularly loyal allies. There's a wide avenue of maneuver for them in many cases. And the United States, if you look like in the Pacific here, you know, it could easily be pulled into a conflict that was not of its wanting, but because of all of its alliances here. I mean, all these entangling alliances are very dangerous for the United States. For a country that voted for a man that wanted America first. Go ahead, Earl.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we have, what, like 700 bases around the world, basically ringing around, surrounding Iran, surrounding Russia, surrounding China. But yeah, absolutely. I think essentially we're providing the military side of the foreign policy for a lot of these countries that are quite well off. And the thing is would peace really and would diplomacy really take hold if we did draw back? You know, and
well, diplomacy
that would not be in the interest of
yeah, but diplomacy would have to kick in. It would have to automatically kick in.
Absolutely.
Instead of just saying, well, Washington said, no, you guys have to sit down and work this out here. I mean, Earl, isn't it remarkable how many borders around the world the United States protects, and it doesn't even protect its own border? Go ahead, Earl, finish up.
Yeah, it is interesting. We have more concern over other countries' security than we do our own sometimes. But you know, there's other political regions in that there's both lobbying groups on the military side, lobbying groups for other countries that have a significant influence on what's going on, and it's not necessarily for America first, unfortunately. I think it'd be better handled maybe facilitating regional discussions and actual talking to people would be much more beneficial, I think, for global peace. But I don't necessarily think global peace is the major objective. I think it's almost disruption is the objective.
Well, its hegemony is the goal, okay? I mean, that's the goal in Washington. Mm-hmm. You know, Daniel, if I could just go astray just a little bit here, you know, I'm sure you've been following the ups and downs and the smoky rooms and mirrors of Russiagate and the 17 hackers in St. Petersburg, which, you know, took about a week of the news cycles. But there's no real concern in the mainstream to talk about the countries that actually really do influence American foreign policy in Washington, D.C. They call it lobbying in the United States here. But, you know, these the kind of influences that Saudi Arabia has, Israel has, Turkey has, Japan, South Korea. We could make many programs about that. But that's almost kind of a taboo subject to talk about. You can go after Macedonian teenagers fine on Twitter. But, you know, a real serious discussion, I'd like to know how many congressmen and senators meet with foreign lobbyists. They don't have to record it. They don't have to tell anyone. But if you accidentally bumped into the Russian ambassador, well, you get a FISA warrant against you. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, you know, you say you'd like to have some serious discussion. I'd like to have some serious discussion about just about anything in this country.
I agree.
I mean, debate is so debased.
I agree.
It's fallen so far about everything. And so it's farcical, really farcical. But yes, influencing American politics. First of all, politics are internationalized for all countries, number one. Number two, I mean, countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Israel maintain huge lobbies in the United States that are extremely effective. The Gulf states, for example, you know, lavish money. Virtually every major think tank in Washington is funded by the Gulf states, and they use that money to essentially shape and control debates. So in Washington, one rarely gets the opposing non-Saudi, non-Israeli point of view. It's completely outrageous.
Yeah.
And the people who are disserved by this are the American people.
Exactly.
Who you know, there are very important issues that need to be thrashed out, but which are being, buried and swept under the rug. It's symptomatic of a political system in deep crisis.
Ivan, long ago it was a long time ago when there was public debate about foreign policy. You never hear anything about that. Just as Daniel was saying, I tell people here in American media, don't say much about Israel and don't say anything about Saudi Arabia. Okay, those are just two examples. Go ahead, Ivan.
Yeah, I think the other participants are right on here. Our whole policy is on autopilot, and what we have is a military that's set up to power project overseas. So we should call the Department of Defense the Department of Offense or the Department of Defense of other countries, because in the few times during our history that the military has been asked to defend the country, it hasn't done it itself. It hasn't done a very good job. In the War of 1812, we got the Capitol burned before they managed to fight the British to a draw after declaring war on the superpower at the time. In World War II, they didn't think the Japanese were capable of attacking Pearl Harbor, so the military failed there. And of course, on 9/11, the fighter jets went out to sea. So we need to increase our defenses and quit, meddling in other countries' business.
Earl, the thing that I find, again, I think Daniel really hit it here, because I'm very disappointed too. And that's why I have my own program, because I can talk about things that I think are interesting, because when I look at the liberal corporate media, there's almost nothing of interest to me whatsoever. It's tragic stories, it's sad stories, it's political posturing, but there's no debate really about policy. And foreign policy is never, ever debated right now, except for China's bad, Russia's bad, and Iran's bad, okay? That's it. That's all you hear 24/7, and you never hear the other side of the argument. Well, why are they so bad? You hardly ever hear it. Go ahead, Earl.
No, I mean, Daniel's absolutely correct. I mean, if you look where the funding goes to some of the think tanks that are very influential, where they're coming from, you really don't have a real dialogue on foreign policy. And it's shoot from the hip sometimes. It's autopilot. It's unfortunate, I think, and even you look at our diplomats. I really, some of the verbiage used in public forums, I'm kind of appalled by, and it doesn't really set a fine example of where we should be as a country, and it should be leading into diplomatic efforts. And we're kind of lagging in that area for the most part.
Daniel, well, I know the person that Earl's talking about. It's talking about Nikki Haley. Before she got her job at the UN, the only foreign experience she had was going to the International House of Pancakes. That's what we have in the United Nations. You get the last word, Daniel.
Well, Peter, if I may correct you on one thing, there is some serious debate in this country. For example, a very lively, serious debate has broken out over Jennifer Lawrence's low-cut dress that she wore in a photo shoot for her latest movie, Red Sparrow. And that was a very wide-ranging debate, very serious, it touched on a lot of important subjects. So
but Daniel, what side of the argument are you on? Daniel, what side of the argument are you on that one there? Go ahead.
No comment. It's much too fraught. It's much too fraught for me. I don't have the courage.
Well, you could be totally destroyed on Facebook and Twitter if you gave your opinion. Okay, God help you. God help us all. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and in Fort Lauderdale. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.